Blowing in. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Irish Influence. As you may have seen from our Facebook announcement, this is the last one for the summer, and we will that's all wrong, restart rather, in September when term begins again. But tonight we have the wonderfully attired Seán Kennedy, who Joe is going to tell you all about. So, sorry, before I forget, thank you as always to the Irish Consulate in Boston for all their help and support. Lovely people over there. Joe.
Thanks very much, Mike Cronin, and thanks wonderfully attired. I really have to repeat that, Seán Kennedy, for being here with us. But very very serious. Thanks to Leisha Moore and to Shane Caffrey from the consulate in Boston, who support us all the way, and who actually begin again in fall with another series of the Irish Influence. So we've got lots and lots of exciting names for you coming up there. But this is, of course, our last one for the summer session. And our guest this evening is Seán Kennedy. Seán Kennedy, who comes from Killarney in County Kerry. He's a professor of English at St. Mary's College, Halifax, Nova Scotia. He was trained in modern Irish literature and culture, and he has focused for most of his career on the works of Samuel Beckett and the psychoanalysis of Catholicism. Seán engages deeply with the erotics of austerity, his phrase, and what he terms the travesties of neoliberalism generally. Biopolitics, queer studies, and disability aesthetics all come within Seán's expansive purview, and he is the founder of the biennial Grieving Ireland conference. Seán's extensive publications include writings on Beckett, of course, and on Ireland, Beckett and Biopolitics, on Queering Ireland, Ireland in Psychoanalysis, and much more. In his personal life, and we're going to get around to talking about this, Seán is a scavenger artist. So we need to know what that's going to be about. But let's not start quite with scavenger artists, actually, Seán, but with Halifax, Nova Scotia, where you now are and where you've lived for some years. Nova Scotian, Halifaxian, and what's your relationship with the place where you now are? Can I ask that?
You cut out on me a little bit, Joe. So is your question, what's my relationship to Halifax now?
Is that now become your home? Is that the home of Seán Kennedy, what you think of it?
Well, I moved outside of the city slightly to a place called Kingsburg, Nova Scotia, which is a small hamlet on what's called the South Shore. And that has definitely become my home. I bought my first house. St. Mary's gave me my first job. And then I bought my first house, and it's looking like both will be the first and the last. You know, one job, one house, and I'm just going to keep it at that. And it's made my life remarkably simple, and I'm very content here. It's quite a magical place, and I'm very pleased here. Yeah.
Right.
I've seen pictures of where you live, Seán. I mean, you are close to nature. You're close to the elements. I mean, you're there in Nova Scotia, where you get battered by the Atlantic, cold weather, warm weather, and everything in between. Do you like that? I mean, does that remind you of home? Is there a synergy between where you are in the west of Ireland in terms of the great outdoors?
Well, if I was to turn my camera around and show you today, you would call it a soft day for sure. The difference is it's like Ireland, but improved to the extent that we have seasons that you can actually talk about as meaningful. Whereas in Ireland, it's the 20-minute rule. And I think that still applies, 20 minutes at a time at home. And that does have a kind of oppressive feel to it sometimes. It's fantastic, and it's not like the worst of all worlds in any sense. But here, summer does its thing, winter does its thing, fall does its thing. It's kind of perfect for me, yeah.
And obviously the one thing, again, that you've got involved with or pursued since you've been there is your scavenger art. Do you want to explain why obviously, in terms of your kind of literary work, your criticism, your academic work, voracious appetite for all those things and brilliant work as well. But to get involved in something that's very, malleable, very kind of textile, very feeling. How's that been as a journey for you?
Well, I guess it's going backwards because I think that the art kind of, as I understood it, started happening to me. I wasn't really conscious of becoming an artist as such. And when I looked back at the works I had made after 2 years of doing it, if you had showed me them 2 years before, I wouldn't have recognized them as something I was ever going to make or even want to make. I would have been kind of shocked by them or, surprised by them myself, which is why I knew they were authentic. It's because they happened in a way that was beyond me in terms of the kind of more intentional work that I do in the scholarly realm. But then I noticed, Madonnas creeping in there, apples were popping up, nails were hugely important. So it didn't take long to realize. And I was working in the triptych form, of course, which is the great form of like religious art. I was making a lot of triptychs. So I realized that there was a whole grammar of possibility in Catholic art that I had recovered and was now repurposing to an aesthetic project beyond Catholicism, but always informed by it. And in many ways, of course, in a profound conversation with it.
And then for the uninformed, scavenger art is literally just that. It's what you're finding formerly live creatures which are now not.
Yes.
On that basis. So what kind of, again, I've seen some pictures of your work. I mean, it goes from big to small and small to big. I mean, what kind of thing are you working with?
What happened was I used to walk the beach religiously, shall we say, and I started finding things that I couldn't leave behind, and they would come home. And then I realized I had a pile of bones, and I had a pile of metal, and I had a pile of wood and feathers, and some shells. And there were only about 5 materials that I used. I started carrying home clams and mussels and realized you couldn't really use them. So not everything was of use, it seemed. And then all of a sudden it refined itself down, and I realized what I was collecting was anything that had been alive or worked on, had been thrown into the sea, had been vomited back up onto the beach, and kind of just, smoothed over by the ocean or worried a little bit by the ocean, by la mer, and just bringing it home. And then bird carcasses. And then I started I bought a toboggan for seals, and I was burying seals in my garden to incubate them. And I realized I was into some more serious matter there. Now I have people bringing me roadkill. People just stop by with a porcupine and drop it on this. So it's the recomposition of decomposition is the glib way of saying it. But I find something very poignant about struggle. And when you see an animal that was so beautifully alive and is now just kind of inert and lying there, there's something undignified about that. And I try to bring it home and give them a second shot at dignity by making them into something more kind of peaceful looking or resolved or aesthetically beautiful. So it has a kind of a redemptive fantasy built in. But it's also a form of grief work for me in relation to my own parents. I have work about my father. I have work about my mother. So it's been really helpful when there's certain things you don't know how to talk about and maybe don't feel you want to talk about anymore, or it's all been said, but it's still with you. It's quite a nice way to meditate on that through matter. And there's something, as you say, affective and touchy-feely, and it doesn't end run around the ego and that kind of defense. So you will go to places that are quite surprising and pleasing when you get there. And sometimes you look at things and go, what have I just made, I mean, I have one called Mother, and it's not a portrait in any meaningful way of my mother, I would hope. But it does reflect on motherhood in Ireland as well in the Catholic tradition. So it comes back to the work I've been doing on the maternal body in the culture in which I was raised, shall we say.
And it's important, again, that kind of tactile nature of building something that, was alive, is still organic. Is that much more, in that kind of conversation you're having with yourself, even if it's not vocalized, is that kind of, again, tactile construction, that kind of reflection on life and death much more important than maybe you just standing there with an easel and putting some paint up? Is it actually the process?
Yes.
Part of that conversation with yourself?
It is, yeah. I mean, the whole thing is working through, and there's grief work, and then there's frustration. A number of them, for example, I make so that they only balance precariously. I wasn't allowed to affix them in any way. So I'd be lying in bed at night and a truck would go by and they would fall over, like the first couple of years. And then you realize, because I was trying to do something with precarity as a reflection on austerity in Ireland. And I wanted that notion of precarity in the kind of economic workforce to be built into the sculptures. So the themes were coming through in different ways. So the process is part of the meaning. And of course, to talk about it too much, you can disenchant the work, but it keeps surprising me and it keeps making itself. So, and I've stopped storing it in my house so I can have guests around. But for a couple of years there, it was oppressive. You'd look around and every room was just full of like slightly musty animals past their best with postcards from the Ghent Altarpiece on them. And but I was discovering something, and now I have a barn that somebody's lent me that I can use to kind of make my art in the village where the feather tree is. And that's opened it up to another level of comfort as a working artist.
And you've used the term recovery time and again there, and maybe we just go back to something about what you've written, and that's about recovering Catholicism or being a recovering Catholic.
Yeah.
And maybe I just go back to your earlier days back in County Kerry, and I just wonder about yourself there, actually, the Catholic from whom you're recovering. I just wonder, were you a devout child? Can you recall?
No. And this is what's interesting about it for me. I think by about the age of 8, I'd figured out that it was all, in my view, mostly bullshit, as I understood it. And I found it quite boring. Being at Mass was, for me, a profoundly boring experience. I wasn't suited to my attention span at all. I liked the occasional incense, but I had figured out what was a fairly disenchanted relationship to the rituals. But the point I would make about recovering from Catholicism, especially Irish Catholicism, and perhaps every Catholicism, because it's a social institutional force, is you don't have to assent to it in order to internalize it. And as I said in my keynote at Buffalo about recovering from Catholicism, internalization precedes evaluation. So you internalize something, then you evaluate what it is you've internalized, then you decide whether you like it or not, but it's already gone in. Women have this problem with femininity, for example, very often. Like you internalize a womanly ideal, then you decide whether it's actually doing you any work, then you realize it's part of the patriarchal project, then you have to kind of recover from it. And that's, I guess, Henrik Ibsen's A Dollhouse, you know, you have to walk away from what you've internalized. But for my project, what's important about that sticky problem of internalization is if you can internalize something that you don't necessarily agree with, it becomes possible to be humiliated by your own choices and to be oppressed by your own preferences. Now, if you take those two facts and you refract the liberal tradition in political philosophy, the self-interested, enlightened, rational individual, or Homo economicus, rational individual, there's so many of our paradigms presume this kind of rational individual. And it presumes like a person making choices in their self-interest. And then the principle of consent becomes like the foundation of the social contract. So everything emanates out from the possibility of consent in the subject. And that's consent has to have some relationship to their own self-interest to be meaningful. That's why you allow them consent before they decide to do things. All of that, it seems to me, is, if not obviated, profoundly complicated by the internalization problem, whereby Catholicism was so ambient, so infused into every moment of social meaning, every institutional ritual, the possibilities of social self, the possibilities of thought, music, eros, sexuality, which I don't believe exists, all of it. So at a certain point, whether you were devout or not, and so you could say, I don't believe in Catholicism still, but Catholicism still believes in me. And you know, you need a particularly sophisticated theory of agency to get through that. And you also need to then, as I understand it, go into an active, mindful recovery project, which is what recovering from Catholicism is. And the brackets around the from mean you're recovering from Catholicism, but you might also be recovering Catholicism if you could find out the bits of it that you wanted to keep. Because I'm not going to go on record as saying it was mere atrocity all the time, because I don't think that reflects accurately on the history of Irish Catholicism either.
Can you expand beyond the self there, and can you dare to speak about recovery, Ireland's recovery from Catholicism?
Yes.
Has Ireland recovered from Catholicism? Can it recover? Must it do? And what dare it not actually unrecover, if I can?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we're all in the same predicament, which is that many of us internalized a value system. Many of us internalized it without evaluating it on the first go round, which is what I think the Jesuits meant when they said, give me the boy for 7 years and I will give you the man. And this is why I think Joyce's portrait had to be a book about an apostasy that was realized and expressed in Catholic terms, because you can only think your way out of the tradition through the tradition, even as you have to have the tradition in yourself to hate it properly, as Adorno says. So on one level, you need to, and this is where Beckett became important to me and where my work is important, I think, is you have to betray Catholicism as an active intellectual and emotional physical project. And by betray, I'm using a specific definition that W.J. McCormack used of Beckett in relation to Protestant Ireland. And he says, you betray your tradition when you refuse not to ask certain questions. Now, if you think of how social reality in Catholic Ireland around people like Lovat and the mother and baby homes and the orphanages, there was a lot of ambient knowledge that we all knew things. And knowledge was everywhere in the culture and it was being mediated in all sorts of ways. And there were all sorts of things we knew. But as Nell McCafferty and other people showed us, one didn't ask. And you hear that all the time in the Magdalene documentaries. You hear it from the nuns themselves. You hear it from Mother Superiors. One didn't ask. So there was a refusal to ask, and now there needs to be a refusal not to ask. And that is a betrayal as an ethical project. So I think that Ireland can't just decide it's over, because internalization becomes part of what Bourdieu calls your habitus or your psychosoma, your body memory. It becomes part of your practical sense. So in a sense, you're always going to be Catholic unless you work through it in some kind of therapeutic project and replace the ideals and preferences of Catholicism with something else.
And
so
yeah. No, please, I just want to zoom back inwards, in again to yourself there. And was there a particular moment in which betrayal became an imperative for you?
Well, I mean, I was doing it all along without having the language to talk about it. And obviously, reading Beckett, I realized early on that what mattered to me most about him, and has continued to matter more as I've understood more of what he's been doing, is his ethical project. Now, there's a kind of a tradition in Beckett studies which says that his work is unethical and that it doesn't have an ethical project. And I disbelieve that. And I think that, I mean, my recent understanding now is that because his mother was an evangelical historically, and of course his father was, like we say, a Huguenot bowler-hatted businessman, but it was through his mother's line that he got that kind of performance of ascendancy, and they lived in this big house kind of reproduction. It was quite a daft kind of a Chekhov thing. And it was 4 people in a house with a dinner announced by a gong and grape shears and doilies. And he was like, what? So absurdist theatre for Beckett begins in his own house. And in many ways, his project is just an attempt to aestheticize what he grew up with in order to betray it. And he was betraying it by refusing not to ask certain questions. And one of them, of course, for him became, what was the role of my people during the Irish famine? And what he learns is that the evangelicals played a key role in framing Irish death as redemptive. Death was good for you. Death will set you free. It was a regenerative discourse, and arguably, like it was, they say, it was a proto-fascist discourse, because your death regenerates you. It's like Christianity is meant to be my death regenerates me, and that's martyrdom. But they outsource the martyrdom. And this happens with evangelical Protestantism, and that's something that he knows in his body. And then he goes to World War II, and he survives the war. He almost gets arrested. His friends go to the camps and die. And at that moment of survivor guilt, he has this ethical crisis where he realizes that he himself, through his people, was complicit in an act of atrocity and biopolitics at home. And it was like a 2-part trigger. The experience in Ireland, which he understood he was implicated in, could be kind of internalized and ignored until the second shock of Auschwitz hits him, and then he realizes that he has to bear witness. But he has to bear witness to things he hasn't seen. So he's in a really complicated position ethically, and this is when the work explodes. And this is when, like, Endgame happens, and this is when, like, he's writing on the run from the Gestapo, but he's alive, and his friends are in the business of dying. And that's when he gets into the big house for real. And that's when he gets into his conversations with Yeats, because Yeats wishes for war, pops his clogs, and doesn't see what happens. Beckett doesn't wish for war, fights in the war, and has to bear witness to what happens. So his big argument after the war is an ethical conversation with Yeats. But he isn't speaking to Yeats from the position of a holier than thou. He's speaking from a position of implication by way of his implication is what Bourdieu would call his ontological complicity, his background complicity with this atrocity of the famine. So the famine becomes far more important after the war than it was before the war. It's not that it's absent in his work before the war. There are glimpses, reference, moments. But after the war, that's like a defining limit event for him. And he realizes that in Ireland, there's a precedent for this kind of management of death and this letting die, and the discourse of regenerative death, which is a key for him. The blood and soil republicanism of, like, Countess Kathleen. So that's the other thing that happens to him. Myself and Joe Valenti are doing some great work on this, I feel, at the moment, around his embrace then of a disability aesthetic. And that's a conversation with Yeats on issues of beauty, form, truth, the romantic tradition, beauty is truth, truth, beauty, all of that stuff. He's like, he gives you Happy Days, and he gives you Malloy, and he gives you, there isn't actually an unbroken body in the post-war oeuvre, I don't think. So they're like, so disability becomes ubiquitous, and he's in conversations with Yeats about form, beauty, purity, Irishness, all of it. So that's the ethical charge of Beckett. And then he taught me how to respond to my Catholic tradition, that treachery is an ethical imperative.
Can I just remind everybody that do ask questions? There's a question answer button there. Please use them. Get to it. Can I don't want to broaden this out if there's a boring historian in the room, but I mean, the one thing that strikes me kind of watching the Irish dealing with, you know, let's call them atrocities, let's call that process of dealing with a collective amnesia, a societal amnesia that existed where people turned the other way.
Mm-hmm.
What strikes me that when you kind of read, you know, there's lots of literatures around the world, but two key ones. What happens to Nazi Germany, vis-a-vis Beckett fighting the Nazis? What happens to Germany after 1945? And the way the West German state just basically pulls up their collective drawbridge. It, you know, you can't talk about it, and by virtue of not talking about it, you're not denying it happened, but you're not processing it. And that's one of the kind of, it's one of the clear failures of the kind of what was the West German state. But in a similar way, there's a similar problem now collectively since 1989, the East German state, where again an ideology was destroyed. And there's a whole idea of the way that the unified German state is dealing with a different set of problems to the Irish one, but how does a state deal with its complicity? I think when you look at kind of German people I knew, kind of, you know, 45 downwards, it's very easy to dismiss what was done by their parents' generation because it was nothing to do with them. And I kind of see that in Ireland at the minute. If you see so much of the activism, you know, around the 8th, around mother and baby homes, you know, it's not all, but primarily the kind of some of the loudest voices in the room are the people who are, you know, 35, 40 downwards. There's some very sophisticated older people who are calling it to account. But what's not happening is that reckoning, where that kind of the middle-aged upwards, as it were, who did walk through Irish towns where they lived, who knew where the Magdalen Laundry was, knew where the mother and baby home was, knew the people who, you know, disappeared. Yeah. How do they have their reckoning, Seán? How does that group that are even, you know, you grew up in a kind of young liberalising Ireland. You could at 8 say, this isn't for me. And it probably didn't cause you huge problems.
Well, I mean,
I'm asking you, can a society have a reckoning? I can see where you're calling your own account,
yes,
and your own experience. What I'm saying is, can post-traumatic societies, to use that expression, can a society have a reckoning, or can it just make the right noise?
It can do both. But you know, in Ireland, one thing we're blessed with is our artists, and they have been doing the grief work on our behalf, holding the space on our behalf since the beginning and during. You know, you go back to Joyce and all these people, they were telling the stories in their own way. They had, but what needs to happen is you can't expect it to happen and you can't let it happen. You have to make it happen. And so I do think that one of the things I'm interested in the Recovering from Catholicism project are rituals that we can use to collectively recognize, acknowledge, mourn, and move through these events. And I think it's really interesting, and we had this with the recent Mother and Child report, where what they were trying to do in that report, I felt retroactively, was read it as a neoliberal society based on a social contract of rights and responsibilities, and you were the father, you were responsible, you had your rights, and you messed up. Why didn't you do the right thing as an individual self? Again, this enlightened self-interest subject of the liberal tradition. Ireland was not like that, and you weren't just ever in Ireland a merely rational, enlightened self. You were so implicated in these webs of culture and society, which had their own sustaining values too, that individual choices were rarely made on an individual basis, the kind that Milton Friedman would recognize as the basis of freedom. So it was a different version of social reality. So that means a couple of things. One is we can't blame individuals here and make it a meaningful grief work. The reckoning has to be collective. We have to telescope out of the pronouns and just say this was a national event of national significance. It was part of a narrative that we were telling, a story we inherited and transposed. We thought we were doing the right thing sometimes. The road to hell was paved with our good intentions. We were also complicit up to our eyeballs, in denial, the whole lot. But if it's a collective set of practices, I feel that you can take away. So I have one idea that I've just been speaking to somebody about here, grief choirs. And this would bring, you know, music, choral singing, to sites like, shall we say, Grenard. And you would just have a vigil, which was a grief choir, recovering from Catholicism, going back, using people like Kevin Whelan's work, going back to Keening, going back to all, there's also a Catholicism before the devotional revolution that we have to remember here. And I think that if people are interested in staying within the Church of Catholicism, not everyone needs to have an apostasy to participate in this project. And I think that's important for me. It's like, if you're in the recovering Catholicism mode, let's talk pre-devotional revolution. Let's go back before 1870, before the disciplining of the Irish body, to sean-nós, to dance, to keening, to public mourning. All of the traditions are there, actually. They just need to be reactivated. And they're in the social body as much as the trauma. And they can be connected. And I don't think we have to do too much work that way. But what we certainly have to not do is allow neoliberal Ireland, with its weaponizing of the language of responsibility, to retroactively deny these people the dignity of their implication in a social reality that they did not get to make choices in. Not meaningful choices of the kind that we can then hold them to accountability for. The social contract is a dialectic of rights and responsibilities. If you obviate my rights, I do not incur the responsibilities. So there's a very devious revisionism going on there. And I mean, I'm all for revisionist historians and history, and Ireland has needed it and benefited from it greatly. But not to do that transposition. That's a paradigm error. That's a kind of a category error. It's a misunderstanding of the historical object of scrutiny there, and a profound one, a dangerous one. But of course, it suits us because then you can individualize responsibility and, as you say, disavow any implication. And this is where the men's rights movement comes from, which, you know, again, it's like, hold on a second. So what we need is, I get that you have rights, but what I'm trying to get to, and Joe Valente's work and Margot's work recently has helped me with this. How do we tell the story of complicity and responsibility in a way that actually reflects the reality of those events rather than a neoliberal version? But there's a collective implication. And I would use the example of patriarchy as a kind of a model. I am a man, but I'm not a sexist man. Is that enough? Well, you say, no, it's not enough, because it's not just about being sexist, and it's not just about claiming power as a man. It's about having power afforded to you as a man. Power that you don't have to work for as a man. And that power is always given to you and accorded to you. And you get to use it whether you are active or passive or not. It's like being white at an airport. You don't have to turn that switch on for it to be working in your favor. So that means a couple of things. That as a man, even when I'm not being sexist, I'm still implicated in, complicit with patriarchy, which means I become responsible for some response, some progressive dismantling of patriarchy from within. So for the Irish people, whether we did any of it or not, we're all still implicated. We all still have this grief work to do, and it belongs to us to do it. And none of us can just say, that doesn't belong to me because I wasn't there. It's in your body, it's in your psychosoma, it's in your tradition. It's in your dreams, and it will be in your nightmares too, unless you begin to deal with it. And of course, for me, living in Canada now with the residential schools, and they're finding mass grave after mass grave after mass grave, you just say, this is not work that's going to stop in Ireland. And so I'm hoping that the project will bring rituals to the process of reckoning, as you say, grieving, and then recovering either from or with a new sense of like responsibility, accountability, and moving then through and beyond shame, which would be the end goal, to recover dignity.
And I certainly would like to hear you talk a little bit more about shame, and I'm very happy that there are questions coming in from people, and please continue to add your questions there. And you've spoken about ritual, and I'm just a little bit concerned about this. I want to imagine the future that you're thinking about, in which you say that ritual is going to somehow or other allow us to move forward. And I'm just a little worried that it's sometimes said about Catholicism that in the 19th century, that it was, above all things, that it was ritualistic, that Irish Catholicism was pietistic and it was performative. And ritual took such a central part in Irish Catholicism that they maybe the spirituality beneath it actually was lost. I just wonder, perhaps babies and bathwater things, if in the future, what will be different about the ritual that you're going to, or that one hopes will replace what was lost? How will that actually be profound and not simply performative and bring us down the same pointless road?
That's a great question, Joe. What's remarkable about Irish Catholicism in this regard is how anti-intellectual it was when Catholicism was such an astonishing intellectual tradition.
Right.
And when, you know, like I went through Catholic school and I sat through a lot of bullshit, as you know. I mean, you're sitting there with your eyes bulging, waiting for some interesting thing to come out of their mouth, and it just wasn't happening. They could have just read us Aquinas, you know, or Augustine. They could have, if you just read us from the theologians, we might have learned something interesting. Like, so there was an utter disconnect between the intellectual tradition and the social ritual. Now, in psychoanalytic terms, what happens there, as you know, is there's a kind of split. And so that the rituals aren't being informed by, they're not being fed by any connection to the liturgy or the theology. So they can't enact, they can't consecrate and reconsecrate the liturgy, and they can't actually tell us anything about the state of our souls. They're empty, rote, repetitive, as you say, and that's what happens. So that the new rituals would have to be very keenly articulated to a set of like precepts or commandments about what an Ireland beyond shame would be trying to do. So grief choirs would have to have an object of mourning. Who are we mourning? And you just move through a liturgy for a person-specific, in a person-specific site like Renard, or you can go to Tune. You can go wherever you think Irish shame hovers in the air and mist. And we all have our sites, and they don't have to be public. They can be private as well. In other words, they can be your own personal collective mourning. So that would be the thing, Joe, would be not to reproduce the disconnect, the anti-intellectualism of the Irish Catholic tradition, which is a choice within Catholicism, because obviously Italian, Spanish, you know, there's such rich, beautiful traditions in painting and all of that.
And you're really making a plea there, Seán, for a kind of a dealing with grief, which is multi-generational, which is, you know, historically chronological, you know, which is the idea. It's not simply defined by the dates of our own life. You know, no. What we saw, what we witnessed. It's the fact it's going to come through your parents, grandparents, etc. So you are really talking about, when you talk about the devotional revolution, etc. I mean, you're talking about something which is reaching long into the past of what Ireland and then our own kind of multi-strand DNA has experienced, which is interesting because then when you talk about site and place, yes, some of it is private, but the idea of where landscape, we talked about this the other week, where landscape is so important to the experience of Ireland and those notion of site specifics, but they are multiple sites. I mean, that makes for a fascinating project because you are really returning people, family, and historic experiences to place. That's
right. And you are recovering. I mean, bear in mind, you know, if you take a poem like Austin Clarke's Martha Blake and you look at them, and when he says about her that her well-taught knees were humble, that notion that there was humility in the back of her knees, and she's on the pew. And I mean, her well-taught knees are not intellectually engaged with the ritual, as Joe points out, but they are they're in the right place, on their knees in front of the whatever. Now, those are the same knees that are expected to dance with joy. And those are the same knees that have been used to, and women have been on their knees in Irish history, and there's lots of beautiful poems by Paula Meehan and people about mothers on their knees. It's all there in the literature to recover and work from. So there's a vast repository of meaning and emotion in the literature. And then we just have to go back to the places, but we also have to go back to the places in our body. Because you can't tell me, like, my brother-in-law is very passionate about Irish music and dance, but like Sean-nós dance, not, as you know, the Book of Kells version, when everything gets refracted through a politics of respectability and posture, you know, which is the devotional revolution, which is a discipline of the Irish body to become a certain kind of respectable Catholic body. That body we have learned, and it's been transmitted through the well-taught knees. But I'll bet you Martha Blake, if you got her in the right situation and into the right rituals, would dance her arse off for you. But I mean, you have to make the events happen. And there has to be some joy in it too. There has to be release and purge, and there will be. Because, you know, shame carried around, especially shame that isn't articulated to any experience in your body, sits like a bolus. It's an undigestible lump of unsymbolized affect. And in psychoanalysis, they call it like a crypt, like a family secret. You don't even have to know the secret. It just passes through your body into the next generation. So that these things get transmitted intergenerationally. And if you don't have the language to speak about them, it's extremely difficult to confront them meaningfully. In Canada at the moment, I'm speaking to a generation of 40-year-old people. And I've heard that each one of them saying to me, we were never taught. We were never taught. So if you're not taught, it's very difficult to take responsibility or to understand. And it's very difficult not to feel overwhelmed and scared. because you need the information to know what we're talking about so that you can then figure out a meaningful ethical response. So they've been put at a double disadvantage. They're being confronted with an event that they have no way to metabolize intellectually or emotionally. And I feel like our generation have the information to metabolize, but we have to create the ritual so the work can be done. Otherwise, we'll get into what you're talking about, Mike, which is a kind of neoliberal disavowal. You know, not I, not all men, you know, that kind of like, well, you have to be very careful because shame was everywhere. It was ambient and, you know, it kind of implicated us all. And we're not all equally responsible, but we are all liable because implicated. And you can do positive joy-bringing work to the project as well.
And we've been talking quite a bit about shame here. And I wonder if you can just give us the origins of Irish shame, if you can do, because I'm a little bit worried. We can go back before the Devotion Revolution, and I think there was a way in which shame was being weaponized by the Philly of ancient Ireland. Shame was a weapon that was used by those in power to keep those in their place. I mean, supposedly people could be shamed into death by the poetry of people in there. So just type of shame that you're speaking about such a big. What was the moment? What was the place? I mean, how was that produced? Was it in the confession box? Was that to the? Where did that actually emerge from? If we are reading it as something that emerged out of the middle of the 19th century, if I'm hearing you properly.
No, I don't think it emerged at the middle of the 19th century at all. I think it took another metastases at that point through the Devotional Revolution. Sarah McKibben's doing some great work for us. We're putting out a book with Edinburgh, and she's going to write about obviously a hugely important defining moment, which explains a little bit why Irish Catholicism is so anti-intellectual, is the Puritan plantations, Cromwell, and the death of Gaelic Ireland. The Irish language goes, into a massive defense. There's a whole set of experiences which are now inarticulable in the English language, have happened in the Irish language, and once that language is lost, you lose another conduit to all of that stuff. So you have to go back to, and it's not like shame isn't an emotion that's like almost everywhere. So when we're saying Irish shame, we're talking about an experience of shame in a place that became Ireland, it wasn't even Ireland at that time, and then became Catholic Ireland, and then became the post-devotional revolution. So you really have to historicize the emotion and look at it through the kind of complex. And I think that at the heart of it for Irish men, and I've written a little bit about this, is just the emasculating reality of being the colonized. And, in the colonial, in phallic masculinity, as I understand it, and I've never been very good at it, but I have observed at school, whilst trying not to die, there can only be one phallus at a time. And you either have it or you don't. And I very rarely got my hands on it. But in a colonial situation, the colonizer has it by default. The rest is posturing. And so that the Irish masculinity was castrated at the knees at that point. The rest is overcompensation. And that's what the post-colonial project turned into. It turns into an overcompensation, which usually means abuse, neglect, and bullying of women and children and other men. So, Irish masculinity gets kind of refracted through a kind of foundational shame, and there's no outside. If colonialism is a structure, not an event, then Irish shame is a structure. And there's no outside to it until you find a way through. And so I think you're right, Joe. The project has to go back to at least then and be before then. And I think that there would be something to say about shame in almost any aspect of Irish literature, going back to before it was even meaningfully like Irish. Shame is an emotion that we all experience. The question is, how is it used? How is it constructed? How is it weaponized?
Sure. Thank you. And lots of questions coming in here. Maybe I'll turn to some of those. Thanks everybody for what you're putting here. And I suppose I'll just go to somebody whom you've spoken about. And of course, that's your collaborator and great friend is Joseph Valenti. It seems, he says to him, that a key to the paradigm shift that Seán is proposing is the idea of grieving. Not just victims as conventionally understood, but grieving our implication in the ills that have created the experience of grief in the first place. And that's a lovely point. Do you want to expand upon that? Do you want anything that you'd like to say, Seán, on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to say it for myself, but I would like to say it for Canadians too, and for Irish people. At a certain point, if you don't do this work of confrontation and the difficult work of acknowledgement and recovery and speech and feeling, you will lose the ability to see yourself in the mirror. You won't be able to look yourself in the eye. A certain version of Irishness becomes unavailable. A certain version of Canadianness becomes unavailable. You can't just sit around and pretend that you didn't see what was happening and you didn't know. Even if you weren't there and you didn't know, you know now, let's get grieving. You know, it's for everybody. And it's grief work, but I can also say that it can be joyous. Like, you can dance, you can do a lot of dance. Like, joy is an important way to talk back to shame. So recovering the body of Irish joy, you know, dance, spontaneous gesture, intoxication, ecstasy, the great feelings of, we'll say, Hopkins in the Windtover, you know, and of course, pleasure. I mean, if, you know, I always try to say to my sister's children, like, the most complicated thing about pleasure is allowing yourself to have it. And just make sure you do, you know, like, you know, have fun now, because there's no guarantee later. It's going to be hot and dry. So we've had enough of that. So yeah, the grieving, and Joe's right. And what I'm really looking for with the grief choir, with Keening, like with Song on a Mountain, like the voices are there, the feelings are there, the knowledge is there. We've got to bring them together in mindful ritual and teach our children what dignity and responsibility actually look like, rather than this weaponized neoliberal bullshit that they're being sold about the autonomous self as the atom of entitlement that moves through the world making voluntary contracts with people. We'll die of that. It's already done huge damage to us. And if we allow Varadkar and the Thatcherites to continue, it will destroy our country morally and socially.
Thanks, Sean. And I'm going to turn to a question from Eve Watson. Hello, Eve. And she loves, of course, the word recover with a hyphen, as in re and cover, conveying as it does a sense of reformulation or reconstituting what's already there, and doing so dialectically, as recovery implies, which changes regeneration, all of the elements, and what emerges is new, but not altogether without the old. Her question. This recovery is implicated in how you work, your thought, art, philosophical outlook. Might you say a little bit about that? And maybe I didn't enunciate that correctly. Her question is, this recovery is implicated in how you work, your thought. A little bit about that. Recovery is being, I say, as I'm reading that, infiltrating every part of your life, insinuating itself into every part of your existence.
My understanding of it is that it's whole body work. I used to dial, I mean, and this whole thing about the town and gown and the mind-body split, and we don't have to be Cartesians here. I'm no longer clear that for me, that it's useful to think of myself as a mind and a body that are articulated. It's one organ, it's one delightful, delicious predicament. And I mean, this again, myself and Joe have been working on Beckett's what we call affective turn, when he just acknowledged, I'm not a philosopher, all I am is feeling.
Wow.
And you think of Francis Bacon, the Irish painter, who said that if you want to do realist painting, or if you want a realist image, take a photograph with a camera. He says, we have cameras now for realism. I'm going to paint sensation.
Yeah.
He wanted to paint how it felt.
Yeah.
And so in my work, I've realized, with the help, Eve, of a great therapist, just to get back to you on this, you are the heroes of the world, therapists, because Freud invented this capacity for healing through recovery and grief work. And I went through it for about 5 years. And a couple of things happened. I stopped dialing in my work. I stopped pretending that it mattered, and I made it matter. But I also started to extract it from my own psychosome, from my own material body. And that meant some vulnerability. Very difficult for me now to give a keynote without, like, you know, losing composure, you would call it as a man, I suppose. Having an emotion, I also call it, feeling something. And, but that, I mean, again, Paul and Meehan, people like that, you don't write poetry like Paul and Meehan's poetry if you're dialing it in. So when you watch the masters at work and you try to emulate them with the humility that you can, you just say, for Paul and Meehan's sake, I'm going to do it this way, the way people like her have taught me to do it. And that means you have to go in yourself first.
Yeah. You've got to put the work in and be real.
And vulnerable and open.
Yeah.
That's nice. Yeah. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, a question from Ed Madden. Could you say more about scavenger art as a kind of ritual for recovery? Are there ways to scavenge the rituals, stories, complicities, images of one's own culture that transpose them into something disorientating and interrogating rather than recuperative? I hope that makes sense. Can scavenger art offer a model for recovery without any sense of ever claiming to be recovered?
Yes. And I would actually say that what I would like to do with my scavenger aesthetic Ed, is I would like to scavenge Irish sites and build works, site-specific works in Ireland. And I like your question because I think you have to be super careful, and certainly being a Beckett scholar, I'm mindful of the idea of the inevitable redemptive quality of the aesthetic event, as if aesthetics only matters if it's redemptive. And, you know, being in the Queering Ireland project, I've learned about the dangers of those kinds of arguments, you know, like, and what is redemptive and what's beyond redemption and what ought to be redeemed. I don't know any of that stuff. I just try to make meaningful, sometimes horrifying, reconstituted objects out of things that I find and that I'm drawn to recompose. And to be honest with you, they have their own will to be together. Certain parts just fall in with a click, and once you see them together, they never move again. So from that point of view, I hope they disturb as much as they redeem, and I hope that they destroy as much as they recuperate.
Okay, and an associated question from Marjorie Howes. Fascinating discussion of internalization. Is there a way in which you think of your scavenger art as an act of externalization, of confronting something that you internalize as if it were external to yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I could show you a work that I have called Behold. And it's an Annunciation scene. And it includes, I think, a bit of a cow, you know, or maybe it's a deer. And there's a bird's head and a wing in there. There's also a postcard from Mary in the Annunciation of the Ghent altarpiece, and some fur and some nasty, you know, bits of insects and stuff. A little bit of disgust is important in the work, but that I realized was me working through my relationship to the Annunciation as a kind of founding moment in Catholicism, but also a founding moment in how women are treated in the church. And I was going to church after church. I mean, Marjorie, I drive around Europe. Annunciations and me are a thing, you know, and I love me a good Annunciation. And Joyce did too with The Dead, and Beckett writes about it in First Love. It's an iconic moment. But the more I got into it, the more I realized that there was something horrible had happened to me. One of the things that had happened to me in the Catholic tradition was I had been made to internalize an ideal of a woman, an idealized woman, and for that reason, an unavailable, unrelatable, and unfindable woman. And so I had been kind of made to internalize something I couldn't find or relate to. And it kind of complicated, and I would say maybe for a while disabled, my relationships with actual people. So that I had to go back into Annunciations to study that scene and see, why are they saying this? What's the function of this whole scene? Where's the issue of consent here? And the hallelujah moment for me was when I realized that internal idealization is a form of misogyny. And it's actually an aspect of the misogynistic project. I mean, the Irish mammy who's impossibly good is just the other side of the ones who end up in Tuam and elsewhere. So if you're going to get over the misogyny of the capital C, you need to bring with it the Irish mammy, the Madonna, and the unreal. Now, the artwork like Behold is me just mustering myself to that, discovering my complicity in that. And I realized that I had like a kind of fairly unreconstructed, patriarchal, dismissive, dehumanizing ideal of women, which was no idea of women at all. And that was one of the things that I internalized without evaluating it and that I have to recover from. And when you see the work Behold, I hope that it kind of symbolizes my attempt to kind of see, you know, the violence of that Annunciation. And you can go to Leda and the Swan for Yeats's fantastical version of it if you want. But, and again, to come back to the problem of internalization and consent, if you can be made to be oppressed by your own preferences and humiliated by your own choices, the issue of consent becomes then even more complicated for an Annunciation scene like that as well.
Quick question. Somebody's asked, is your art available to view anywhere?
Oh God, you know, I mean, it ought to be. And the problem here is like being online without being on social media. And so I'm off Facebook and I'm off Instagram. So the answer is at the moment, no, which is ridiculous, but it's a work in progress. I'm trying to get my own website going.
Okay. So watch this space.
I want to go back a little bit actually to you and internalization of that ideal object. was, and we've spoken about the Annunciation, and I also know about your fascination with the Immaculate Conception, another one of those very peculiar moments actually in our beatification of Mary. But also there was perhaps for some people, and Eve Sedgwick writes about this, the internalization actually of that image of Jesus Christ himself, and that to which many young Irish pious boys perhaps were exposed. And that was that single semi-naked image that was available in Ireland, and that was of the battered and bruised and broken body of this man hanging up there. And I wonder actually, I mean, if you have anything to say about the internalization of that particular eroticized, hugely eroticized object within Western art of the broken body of Christ, and what that does to the Irish male.
Yeah, that's a great question. And a way to do that, Joe, I think, is again, if you go and you look in the Italian tradition at Christ in the Pietas, after he's been taken down from the cross and he's in his mother's arms, that iconic moment. In most of the Italian works, he's an olive-skinned goddess in a little, wraparound thong with maybe a drop of blood somewhere to indicate he's been through something, but he looks like he's actually on the beach having a pretty fine time. They've completely sublimated the suffering, and they've made it into a kind of gorgeously redeemed male body. And you could almost jump his bones. You go to the Flemish tradition, you do not want to jump his bones, because every wound, every drop of blood, the pus, they bring you the violence of the suffering Christ. The Italians have this kind of redemptive Christ. They've already moved, the aesthetic is here doing massive work of redemption, redeeming him from his suffering, but also in a Lucas project, redeeming his body to the way it looked before he suffered, which is a dubious thing to do, in my opinion. I don't see why you would redeem his body from its suffering if martyrdom was the point of his spectacle. So the question then becomes, in the Irish case, what kind of Christ were you looking at? Because you're talking about specific churches in Dublin, and I think you almost have to go to the individual version and say, was it the sublimated Christ? Was it the Flemish Christ? Or was it an Irish kinky hybrid? So what's your gut feeling on that?
It's a great question indeed, and I'm aware of the very different representations of that dead Christ. There's a particular one that strikes me actually in the Carmelite Church there just off Grafton Street, in which there is this down from the cross in the most eroticized version almost of the dying Gaul in this white sepulchral, gorgeous and hugely beautiful body. And as you say, very, very different from the Flemish one. Nevertheless, I'm trying to say that certainly, at least in my time, the only naked body available to me was the body of that Jesus Christ. And I just wonder where that leads.
So, I mean, have you, because I give lectures in the barn here in Kingsburg to the community as part of my community outreach for the Irish Studies program. And one year I gave what I call an orgasmic reading of Gerard Manley Hopkins' The Windtover. Now, it's not just that the poem is orgasmic in its rhythm, and I think you can actually even get to the point where the orgasm happens, here, buckle, and perfect. So the sonnet form has been given an orgasmic reading, but of course it's him looking to Christ our Lord, which is the dedication on the sonnet. But of course what he's thinking about is, the argument I make is this man that he fell in love with, whose name was something like splendid in English, like Digby Dolben Dobin or something like that. He maybe met him twice. But the point is, all of that kind of affect, of homoerotic affect, is being kind of triangulated through the Christ, because, I mean, it's right there, as you say, and it's been pierced. I mean, Saint Sebastian's an important here as well. So I would say that, yes, there's massive work to be done there, but it's very difficult to generalize until you see the actual versions of the Christ that people were presented with. And I think the joy of that for us as scholars is you have to be super specific, because, and I mean, but of course, Manley Hopkins would have gone and traveled and seen them elsewhere. But Irish Catholicism is a kinky blend of Catholicism and Puritanism. And that changes everything. That changes everything, and not for the better.
Absolutely. And can I just go on with a comment from Joseph Valenti, actually, which I'm really particularly interested in, because he says there is no more thoroughly, he asserts, misogynistic conception than the Immaculate Conception.
Yes. I mean, this is for me, I mean, at this point you get into like retroactive plumbing of the matrilineal line. Now, I did a lot of work on this recently when I was in Spain, and I had the great fortune to walk past a Pedro de Mena exhibition in Malaga, and he was a Baroque sculptor. And in the Spanish tradition, which is a whole other kettle of bloody, I mean, Jesus Christ. There's a lot of work to be done there. I don't have the language to do it, but it would involve Franco. But it would also involve that Baroque period. Yeah. And if you go to Spain and you look at Romanesque churches, and then you go to a Baroque church, you realize what T.S. Eliot meant about the dissociation of sensibility. But there they were. It was 2 rooms full of sculptures, beautiful. I mean, like this guy, de Mena, can sculpt. He carves the pews in Malaga and elsewhere, and he's like massively important in world historical art. But he's trying to sculpt an event called the Immaculate Conception. Now, as you know, in art, in order to communicate emotion, you need some kind of bodily form. They call them pathos formulae. You need the body to be doing something to kind of communicate the message. And so there were all these famous pathos formulae. The body would do this, grief was like this, and so forth. So you're trying to capture an Immaculate Conception as a dogma in a gesture, and she does this. She's doing this. So she looks like she's holding like a penis that she's never had her hands on. And this is their attempt to kind of find a pathos formula for an unrealizable, because entirely concocted and utterly spurious, theological moment of utter crap. So, I mean, he's like, how do you do it? Like in the Annunciation, and I have a lot of work on this as well, if you go to the Cestello Annunciation in Botticelli, where she is like this, and she's doing the Nole Mi Tangere, and I gave this, that's do not touch me, and that has implications for rape culture. But then you go to like Filippo Lippi, and it's all like, oh, I can't wait to get you in. I feel like you've already, and he's like, I have. Oh, great. Well, so there's consent in the body. Well, how do you tell the story through the body of the Immaculate Conception? It just looks like somebody who's holding, somebody who's dropped their chips.
One way that you do, as you point out, Seán, to me at one time, was that you've got little Beauty looking up her dress. I mean, how wonderful.
Right. And if you go to them every single time, there's one angel looking up her dress. I'm like, what's going on here? It's fascinating stuff. It's demented. But for me, it's like, in terms of, you have to have moments of fun in this as well, and I get great pleasure, both from the aesthetic beauty of the objects, and de Mena is one of the real guys. And I love actually really bad painting now, like a bad Annunciation is great. But you also have to remember, to take pleasure in learning about the cult, I'm glad I didn't have a Freudian slip there, of Mariolatry that has deformed our tradition, deformed Christianity in its patriarchalization, and needs to be recovered. Like the bait and switch of Adam and Eve, for me, is like the founding moment. You got to go right back there. And I was in San Gimignano, if that's the correct pronunciation, in Italy, and Bartolo de Fredi has these frescoes in the church there, and it's actually Eve coming out the side of Adam's body like a cesarean section, and you just think that's it. It's a complete transposition of the reality of the case. And Goebbels said this, and this is like, pick a lie, make it big, and repeat it. And this is where the annihilation of the maternal body begins in Catholicism, and this is where it gets transposed into Irish culture, and this is where it gets transplanted into me, and into like reproductive politics, the whole shooting match. And I mean, as an Irish man, like, to finish off, I think like a great way to betray Ireland on its own behalf now is to refuse not to ask certain questions about how we have treated the maternal body. Let's start there as a bunch of dudes. Not talk to women about it. They know all about it. They were the object of our investments and interests. Let's have a talk with men in which we call each other out, divest, boycott, and sanction that kind of weaponization of what is a vulnerable foundation of our society, a person with their child.
Wow.
If you're going to go there to, as your point of oppression, and vulnerabilize that, and make that the basis of your spiritual quest, we've got some work to do, some dancing and some grief choirs, because it's egregious. And I've suffered a lot from it just because I'm sensitive and I feel these things. But I'm not alone in any stretch of the imagination. Wonderful. I wouldn't think.
Wonderful.
And just before you,
please.
I was going to say, just before you finish, because it's a conversation we were having before we went live, can you just explain about your feathers? People might be interested in.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is part of like my own recovery from Catholicism. I'm really getting back into just the pagan body, feather magic, vibrations, making up my own rituals, consecrating them through conviction and practice and intentionality. And one of them is just recovering from that slightly sluggish relationship to pleasure in the Irish body and just dancing with feathers down at the feather tree with intention and then leaving them on the tree. The feather tree is a community gesture, And it's just to remind people that community is an ongoing process of commitment and gesture. You have to replenish the tree with feathers. They blow away, you bring more. And it's just like a meditation on how community is only as good as its next kind gesture to itself. And so that's part of my work here for myself. And it's also fun, like, you know, but feathers are magic. They're great to dance with, and they've also been important in my work. So it's all kind of melding in, as Eve Watson said, in one psychosomatic project. And I hope that means it has integrity.
I'm sure it does.
Who doubts that it has? And that was an absolutely wonderful conversation, Seán. Thanks for bringing us down so many absolutely wonderful, exciting and beautiful roads. And thanks to everybody for actually being here. There's a series of you who had questions there that we're not going to get around to. I'm very, very sorry, Paul and Patrick and Michael, and that we just didn't do it. But thank you all. Thanks, Seán, particularly. Thanks, of course, yet again to the Consulate. Thanks to Leisha, and thanks to Shane, and thanks to the people in the background who help us here, Peter and Claire and Mike as well, for allowing us to do this. And we look forward to seeing you all in when? We don't have quite a date, but in September, in the next semester. Mike,
yep, it'll be early September. So I think everybody should go away and have a very good summer. And thank you for those people who've been here throughout this. Just a reminder, if you just can't cope with life without the Irish influence, everyone that talks is up there on YouTube, so share it with your friends and family. And Seán's talk will be up by Tuesday next week, and there is so much in that talk, Seán. That was absolutely stunning. I think people really need to go back and think about some of the big questions that were asked there. So Seán, thank you.
Totally. Thank you so awfully much, Seán. Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining in. Brilliant.
We can tell you